So my name's Kris. I'm talking to everyone from New Hampshire, so it's nice and early for me. It's only 9 a.m. here. It's not 3 in the afternoon. I think hopefully folks know who I am by now. I've been to Apex Connect a number of times and other various things. So specifically, we're going to talk about ORDS. We're going to open with maybe some Q&A if folks want around the free service and what's been going on there and what the future over there is. But in general, I look after ORDS, SQL Dev, SQL Dev Web, CL, the modeler, a couple upcoming cloud services, and a few other things as well. And I'm fairly easy to find. I think a number of people have reached out on Twitter or other mechanisms, or emails honestly aren't hard to guess at Oracle. It's first name, last name. So obligatory slide I have to put up because we are going to have a roadmap-y slide later on with lots of stuff on it. So safe harbor. So I think most people know now what ORDS is. So ORDS, maybe not entirely, because ORDS has many faces it has. So number one is, obviously written in the name is RESTful services to and from the database. Probably the most used, at least in this talk, is it is the conduit for APEX. So APEX itself is mostly a PL/SQL engine. So something has to translate that web request into a PL/SQL call end of the day. And we also have quite a number of customers that are on old school mod PL/SQL OA toolkit directly. So same kind of foundational pieces as APEX with the OWA PL/SQL packages, but not using APEX. And then the third, which is getting lots of usage in the cloud, is a web-based client. So our SQL Dev Web is actually just a feature in ORDS now. We have a fairly robust set of database management APIs. So you can actually run everything from a full DBCA, so installing a database. The database home has to be laid down. We don't have any fast path there. But once the home is laid down, you can actually run DBCA, create a database, more REST APIs to configure a PDB, more REST APIs to actually configure ORDS for the PDB you just created, and then REST enable it. And then from soup to nuts, you can go from a plain Oracle home laying on a machine to a fully REST enabled schema doing things. And then the final one for now anyway is a Mongo document style type API into Oracle. So if you're dealing with JSON documents in and out of the database, this is a nice REST interface. And then maybe even more important for this is, I don't know how many people notice this. Part of the problems of big companies is I didn't even see it until it was noticed and other people told me. The mod PL/SQL and embedded PL/SQL gateway are getting deprecated in APEX. So APEX is all in, right? So going forward, we've written a number of optimizations between ORDS and APEX, and that's only going to grow in the future. So there's a lot of symbiotic things going on there. So if anyone doesn't remember history, we started out, actually it started in 2010, I think. I was bored and I looked at mod PL/SQL. I inherited mod PL/SQL, I'll phrase it different. And then realized quickly that that's not the future, right? Some C-based program plugging into Apache when things like Nginx are skyrocketing in popularity, and Apache's still very popular, but still not leading the charge anymore. So I started out with doing just the OA toolkit stuff, purely as a replacement for mod PL/SQL, and then you can kind of see the lineage there. We've progressed, adding more and more things over time. So now just architecture questions. People always ask, kind of what is the best architecture we should do for deploying our orgs? It's a very hard question to answer because it depends on so many things, on infrastructure, internal security, internal requirements, things like that. The simplest way is there's a Jetty Web Server. If you don't know what Jetty is, it's an Eclipse project. It's quite a high-performant web server. They have on their website lists of things that run Jetty. I believe last I checked, like Yahoo Mail, for example, is running on this embedded web server. It is production supportable. We used to say it was for development only, but no longer. The benefit here is there's fewer things, fewer moving parts, the simplicity. It's a web server that's purpose-built for ORDS, for APEX specifically. I apologize for the coughing. On top of it being COVID, everything's on fire. It's allergy season here, so I'll try and minimize that as much as I can. So basically, when the requests come in, we come into this embedded Jetty. We can front end many different databases. Any static files should be moved out to the file system. So I know it's super easy to upload shared components and have those things served right out of the database, but end of the day, we actually don't want database hits if we can avoid them. So pushing things like that to the file system are actually much more performant. So now one more realistic thing is a lot of people put it inside Tomcat. The main reason here has nothing to do with performance, nothing to do with stability, nothing to do with any type of those things. It's more to do with if I need to, say, do a rewrite rule on the URL, if I need to integrate with Active Directory, if I need to have multiple document groups going, if I want to deploy ORDS multiple times but only have it addressable from one DNS name. Those types of reasons are the reasons to go to a full-fledged web server, because in Tomcat, you can deploy ORDS or other things multiple times. You can have an ORDS 1, an ORDS 2, and ORDS 3, and have the one container running there. The majority of the reason I see people use WebLogic is because they're comfortable with it, or they need OAM integration for single sign-on. So those are kind of the main reasons to go to the more full-fledged web servers instead of using the standalone. Now, the other thing in this picture you'll notice, I added in the firewall. So typically, the ORDS is going to be running in a network zone that is not internet reachable. You're going to have something like an Apache, a load balancer that is your tip out there that is accessible. Obviously, these things vary again, right? So on an internal network, internal app, intranet web, you probably don't need 3 tiers of firewalls. Maybe there's just one that protects the database. All these things are variable. Now, one thing we did is, I don't know, I assume folks have heard that APEX was used for building a series of COVID apps for Oracle, for helping out in many different ways. So one of the things we did is we actually, from a single database that is a rack database, so there are 2 nodes for failover, we actually deployed multiple ORDSs, multiple load balancers. So the reason for this is the most valuable resource we have, right? If you look at this entire stack, the one resource that is going to exhaust before any other resource is this JDBC connection pool. So at the end of the day, there's a finite number of things you can be doing in parallel at once. So the pool is that thing, right? Serving static files, that's not really going to be a compromisable bottleneck. So what we ended up doing is we chose that, APEX application 100 came in through this set of load balancers, through this set of ORDS into the database. Application 200 comes down the middle stack. Application 300 comes down the right-hand stack. The reason for this is, say there was a DOS attack on application 100, and you were sharing one ORDS set of connections, one ORDS connection pool, one instance of ORDS. You just impacted every single person using that ORDS app, or ORDS or APEX, any application at all. So what we did is we took this this layout here, and then each one of these ORDS is running in standalone in production. We did load test them, we broke them, we took them to their breaking point. So I have zero concerns of the standalone server surviving DOS attacks. But what it did point out is that, like I said, this JDBC connection pool is the limited resource. So we need to protect it at all costs. So if somebody initiated a DOS attack or a DDoS attack, which is even worse, against application 100, application 200 and 300 continue. And then, not to get into it too much, but each one of those applications had different whitelists, different number of users. For example, the third one over here was Oracle internal only for customer support. So if the external app for some reason hit a DOS attack and people could not sign up, the internal support team could still get to the application that is their support to help customers when the customers called in. So the takeaway here is the architecture is non-trivial depending on the application. If it's a simple internal, maybe a corporate lookup or something that's not DDoS concerned, which is honestly probably nothing these days because a DDoS attack is outright trivial to orchestrate. There's many options. So there is no one blueprint that we could say, here's the blueprint that serves all purposes. So it's just depending on what the applications are. Now, with this all said, again, the connection pool is the single most valuable resource in this entire setup. So scrutinizing the connection pool configuration is, I think I say it in every talk I do on ORDS, is critical. And again, there's no magic numbers here because at the end of the day, ORDS is simply running the code that the customer typed. So say I write a really badly performing SQL statement versus a really highly performant SQL statement. That's going to have massive impact on what the size of these pools are and what the size of concurrencies are. So obviously faster is better, not always possible, but you have to take that into consideration. Back to here, for this setup, we actually ran connection pools of 300 max. And under a DDoS attack, we actually never even approached 300. We approached, 300 times 3, so 900. And under DDoS attack, we never went over 347, I think was the number. It was mid 300s. And in part, that's because the code itself was highly performant that we were running because we take great care there. So the number one takeaway is write fast code, think about the isolation of the applications you're building, and scrutinize these connection pools. And then on the slide here, and again, I think I've said this every time, more isn't always faster. Because remember, at the end of the day, you're fighting for CPU cycles on a CPU. So say your database machine has 50 cores. If you have a connection pool of 5,000, guess what happens? You're going to be queuing at some point in that process, right? I mean, it's physics. There's nothing magical here that's going to happen. So the more you fight for that precious resource of the database and its CPU cycles, the more this stuff becomes important. Editing these things is quite easy. There's a command line for doing it, which personally I never use. I always edit XML file. Just obviously be careful of messing up the XML file. I use XML lint after I edit to make sure that I didn't get a quote out of place, an angle bracket out of place, anything like that. The full list of these settings are in the doc. We used to print all the defaults into the files, but turned out printing the defaults is kind of useless, honestly, because then the default is codified in the code and expressly set in the connection property file. So it's quite redundant. So we made the choice, I don't remember when it was, that in here we would only put the non-default values. So for the full list of things, it is in the doc. There's many of the connection pool settings that are there. If you look at the JDBC ones, for example, there's idle timeouts, there's abandoned connection timeouts, there's max use of a connection. Now what we've done in cloud, an autonomous database, free service included, is we've basically offshored all these config files into a central configuration. So when ORDS starts up in cloud, it basically has amnesia every single time. It wakes up, it has a URL to go fetch its configuration from, and then it bootstraps itself from there. And then every single one of these connection type setups is actually dynamic on demand. So if you sign up for a cloud service, free, paid, anything in autonomous, ORDS knows nothing about it, zero, until that first URL request comes in. Once that request comes in, we actually make RESTful callouts to this thing internally we call broker. You can just kind of think of it as a central inventory. And that central inventory will tell us that URL ABC is really, hostname X, port foo, TNS string blah, and then we connect and we start going from there. Now we are very aggressive out there with our connection pools, and this is one of the things that's going to help the free service out. One of the things that's been suffering in this free service is the limitation of 20 connections. Just yesterday, I was looking into a customer in South America. They were hitting a HTTP 503 error, which means basically ORDS couldn't connect to the database is what it translates to. I can't remember the exact string on the screen. But the problem is free service capped at 20 connections. They had, I want to say it was between 7 and 11 connections from a desktop tool, not SQL Dev, but I won't mention the name. So that immediately chops down the number of connections available for ORDS. So we'll just use round numbers to make it easy. So say they had 10 connections from their desktop, now you have 10 connections for all of ORDS. We actually currently run 3 ORDS nodes in production for every single region, every single data center. So now 3 nodes of ORDS in a round robin sharing 10 connections means 3 connections each. You're gonna run out of capacity really fast. And then couple that with the way ORDS works. I don't have the slide in here, but I know I've shown it before, is we actually use proxy connects. So we connect to the base ORDS public user, we proxy to say the KL Rice schema, we do the work, we unproxy, we go back, right? So it's resource sharing. The alternative is having connection pools per user, which is just messy and honestly a waste of resource. So there's a fix coming in the database. It's been there forever. But when you do that proxy, it counts as a second session in the database. So now back to the 10. So we're at 10 over 3, so 3 per effectively. And then every time you do some work, you actually proxy to, say, the KL Rice schema, and that's a +1 as well. So you can see how this math just doesn't work. So what we're doing now is we're getting very aggressive, and we're going to idle these pools down to 0 if they're idle for I think it's 30 seconds. So if a user is on a screen and you think too long or anything, in 30 seconds, these connections are going to be closed, recycled back to the database, so it's back in the available connection pool. And then the other thing coming soon, hopefully, is that second counter is not going to happen. So it's going to be back to the 10 divided by the 3 per ORDS node. Still not a lot. So one more thing that's coming for, in general for ATP, but will be most visible in free service, is a more nicely formatted page that says, by the way, you've hit the limitations of your connection limits, click here to upgrade effectively. Not really, but something that says you've hit the limits and here's why, and here's how to learn why. So that's some of the stuff coming from free. There's been other things that have happened in free, and I can tell you every single day, my entire team and I get together and we review production issues. So when things happen, when patterns happen, that's nice because then we can find the patterns, we can fix the problems. The tricky part is when isolated anomalies happen. So there's been different cases where say a PDB got stuck in a restarting state, for multiple days, or an ACL happened to not be put in place, or things like that. Those are a bit trickier because we're still working on how to detect all these things. I mean, so now we also have alarms in place. So whenever there is a HTTP 503 event, someone's pager actually goes off, which is blessing and curse. So it's good for you all, it's bad for our sleep patterns. But the net result is things are getting much better than they were. If anyone has questions around free service, maybe now is when we can do it, but otherwise we can do Q&A generally at the end. I see nothing on the screen, so. So now REST services for the database, right? In essence, ORDS is really a translation engine if you think about what it's doing. It's taking in HTTP traffic, it's taking in URLs, it's taking in payloads, it's converting it into SQL, PL SQL at the end of the day. That's what it's doing. So it's more or less a big old translation engine. We handle JSON coming in. So if you use some of the auto REST features, you can just enable a procedure and it automatically REST enables and does the JSON to and from JSON and the request. Hopefully I don't have to sell people on what REST is, but REST is a style. There's nothing truly codified. There's no hard rules. What the payload is, you know, we, Oracle, and the internet mostly agrees that JSON is the payload of a REST API, but it's not a fact. REST kind of stops at the URLs. What happens below that is just kind of recommendations and accepted practices more than hard rules. And then the nice thing, a lot of people ask me, when should we use ORDS versus, you know, rolling our own Node REST APIs or our own Jersey APIs or our own whatever? Simply, my answer is usually what is the core competency of your developers. So if the developers live and breathe SQL, PL SQL, right, then ORDS is probably the best choice because we made it pretty much, you type in SQL, PL SQL, and you can get REST APIs. You're not learning a net new language, a net new architecture. Those kind of things fall to the side because you're sticking with your core competency. And this is an age-old slide we've been using forever, but kind of outlines we're getting traffic in, we do the maps, we do the binds, we execute the stuff, whatever it happens to be, we transform it back, and the end user gets JSON. For example, there's one customer where the guys writing the front end simply aren't allowed to touch SQL, period, or PL SQL. Their only interaction with the database is through REST APIs defined in ORDS. So the front end guys would have to file tickets and say, hey, I need my HR record and I need it to be this shape, I need these data things. And they would file a request to the backend team, and the backend team would fire up a new REST API in ORDS, and that was the handshake. Oh, these transitions. So breaking things down roughly, right? ORDS is mounted. ORDS is at the low level of Java servlet. So we mount that up with a name. That's just how things work. This is renameable, as a lot of people know and have found out. There are implications in the config files when you rename this thing, but that just has to be consistent. Next is the schema name. And the schema name, pretty much always want to alias it, because otherwise you just gave some hacker a piece of knowledge that they may not have had, which is you have an HR user in your system. And then we break things down into modules, templates, and handlers. So from here down is kind of, it can be n number of segments to the paths. It's all in how you organize things. It's just choices. So there is a set of dictionary tables we have called like user _ orgs _ services, and you can get the full list of what's defined in the database. In progress, here's where the safe harbor comes in. We're working on making DBA equivalencies of these views so that someone privileged enough there's an ORDS administrator role we install in the database. If you have that ORDS administrator role, you'll be able to select star from DBA ORDS services, which would give you obviously the entirety of the database, everything that's defined everywhere. I'll come back to why we're doing that, other than being nice. There's PL SQL APIs, there's help on the command line. Most people end up using the PL SQL APIs at the end of the day because we need them reproducible into, say, your production environment. You need to be able to pack it up into a deployable script so that you can have it in multiple places. I'm not sure if everyone knows who Doug Galt is, but Doug Galt was on my team for a short window, and while he was here, we had him build these screens in Apex. So probably the best screens that exist right now are these screens in Apex, which is blessing and curse. It's great for this audience because everyone's all in on Apex. The other side is people want ORDS access without using Apex. They don't currently use Apex at all. So when we do talk to them, we have to introduce them to Apex on top of introducing them to ORDS. So it makes the conversation just a little longer. So you'll see on the roadmap, we have an answer around here. There are also screens in SQL Dev Desktop, if you're in there already. So then when you're into defining REST APIs, there's multiple options. So there's what we call auto REST. If anyone has a better name, let me know. But basically I can say, enable this table, enable this package, enable this procedure. And it stops right there. The ORDS code base onto this whole low code concept, right? So I write one PL SQL function or right click in one screen that says enable my table M. No more code needs to be written. You automatically get full CRUD. You get insert, update, delete, and a bulk load. So you can actually post in a CSV straight for loading tables. Obviously, these things are have use cases. There's places for it, places not for it. You wouldn't want to do this for, say, a production table, but you may want to do it for a staging table that you merge into later on. Doing a bulk load of a CSV into a production table personally scares me. So I would never enable it for that. And there's lots of things in here. So you get insert, update, delete. You also get a query on that table automatically. And I don't think I have a slide on it, but if you look at the query API in the doc, you can enable a table for query, and then the end user on the front end can actually send in predicates. So you can say, by the way, give me all the employees in New Hampshire only. You can actually send things in. Again, all you did was REST enable the table, and all these things start automatically. Now, of course, the opposite of this is what do they call it? It's not low code, high code, I forget. But anyway, is you write all the code, right? So I want to have a REST service named foo. Inside that REST service named foo, it might be a SQL statement, and here's my 3-page gnarly SQL statement that I've tuned over the years, or here's my PL SQL API that has to happen. All these things are possible, right? Because we give you a blank window, you can type whatever you want. You can even control the outbound HTTP status codes. You can control what the JSON payload looks like. You can leverage JSON in the database so that ORDS isn't re-encoded in JSON. So it's maximum control. So on the auto side, like we said, you get full CRUD APIs plus query, plus data loading, plus the metadata. You can get the definition of the tables. Now, if you want to REST enable, say, a table for query only, currently the only mechanism we have that is easy would be to create a view over the table and then REST enable the view, because then the view is read only. We actually don't support updatable views yet. That's on the endless list of things to do. Now, for tables views, it pretty much follows the REST patterns. Now, when you enable PL SQL, we're more or less getting back to RPC type execution, right? There's no REST. If there is REST in there, it's because some developer was very nice about their ins and outs in the PL SQL, and they followed a REST pattern. But in general, it's an RPC. You fire an API call, It executes PL SQL, you get a response back. It doesn't have the nice things like pagination, like next links, like self-references, all these kinds of things. And then we have the modules, which again, this is just the groupings we picked. So kind of analogous, I guess, to a PL SQL package. So you can package up a unit of work. You could have, for example, an employees package or a module, and then under there you could have, you know, the employees departments, the employees addresses. You can break it down by that. There's a few controls here. You can publish, of course. Hopefully that's obvious. Pagination. The interesting thing about pagination is if you set it to 0, it means nothing. It means no pagination at all. Give me the world. And then if we rewind all the way back to the database and protecting it, there is a setting you can set in the config files as a safety net. So even though you set pagination to 0, you might not actually want someone to download 1 billion rows through ORDS through REST. So there's a safety net there for maximum number of returnable rows. And then from there, the next step down is another grouping. We call it templates. And then under the templates, you have multiple methods. So you can kind of break it down a little bit there. And then when we get to the handlers, that's where kind of the nuts and bolts of PL SQL or SQL start kicking in. So here I want to do outbound parameters for location. Maybe it's doing a redirect, as you can see on the left-hand side over here. I don't know if you can see my mouse. Just so you know. Or on the right, or maybe it's the response. So response meaning the payload of the HTTP. So if I wanted to have these as outbound JSON payloads, I just set it to response. Then input and status translates back to HTTP status code. So this is, I added an employee. I took these inbound 4 parameters only from the JSON payload, which is specified as JSON is only allowed. And I do a 302, and I just created employee number 61, basically. Now, in ORDS, there's many ways to do and define REST APIs. So there's queries, query collections, feeds, PL SQL, media resource. Basically, the query to query run row are the old school versions. So the collections of the newer versions. Query one item, the main use case, the real use case for that is if you're expecting one and only one row back. So obviously then things like pagination don't have to kick in. And you effectively get a single record as opposed to an array of records. So it's all convenience type things. PL SQL, of course, is freeform. Do whatever the heck you want. Use as we just saw, inbound, outbound parameters and map them, or use plain old http.p and customize whatever payload you want. There's another slide on getting that payload coming in. Going out, you would use http.p. And then kind of the catch-all is the media resource, which is freeform. So if you're streaming a log out of the database or anything. So feed multiple records, it automatically generates link columns, link entities in the JSON document. The media resource, we actually use this internally. I think everyone's probably seen like the ARIA demo of our internal corporate lookup. For example, on that, the images that people see for their profile are serviced out of media resources. So there's a structure to what the SQL looks like. Like the first column is the MIME type, application image/JPEG or whatever. The second is just a raw blob. So I can say select image JPEG, comma, my blob column from employees where employee email equals Kris Rice, and you would get my image out of it. Now there's some interesting ways to get these things back in. So if I do an upload, there's implicit bind variables. called body. So I know last time I was at Apex Connect, I can't remember the gentleman's name, but they have an application that runs on a tablet and is for doing deliveries. So at the end of every delivery, they take a picture of the package being delivered, and then through this mechanism exactly right here, they upload that image to the database. They use the colon body variable, and then it goes into a table, and then they have their record that the package was delivered. Whoops. And then the catch, of course, here is the body truly means all the body. So if there's any extra payload you need, like these titles or this content type, it's going to come in through headers. So the body is a binary blob of the entire body. So if you're trying to mix and match a body to have some ASCII stuff and a lob, this isn't the right way to do it. Or phrased differently, you can do it this way, but then you're going to have to take on the work of parsing the body, which is a blob, back into something else to then shred it apart. Now, we had a popular request, I guess, is people ask, well, what if my body is not a blob and it's a clob? Well, there's obviously many ways you can convert a blob into a clob, very documented. It's, it's not rocket sciencey stuff. However, to make stuff easier, we actually added a bind variable, another implicit one called body underbar text. And that gives you an actual clob. So then using things like Apex JSON or text parsing makes it much easier. Some of the nice things that are built into ORDS, if your column alias starts with a $, it actually automatically turns it into a link. So you get this entire, what do we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines of link right there for free just by aliasing a column. And then if you alias 2 columns, then you'll notice here it says rel URI. That's where it picks it up from. You could alias as many columns as you want. So for example, on an employee record, you may want to out of bound a link to the department or to the person's manager or to, I don't know, a report of everyone else that's in the same office, things like that. So this makes it very easy. Now there's a bunch of other implicit bind variables and whatnot that exist as well. Again, these are fully in doc, but for example, current user, that's the authenticated user. So if rewinding all the way back to the Tomcat and WebLogic, if I say hooked up my single sign-on, current user would actually be whatever I logged into the web TA. And then the same for some of the other. These are internal binds. So anyone writing code, you will not be able to use these exact same bind variables. So if in your REST API, you're thinking about using something like fetch offset, rename it to something else because we're going to override it. Now the sources, the UIs make it really easy to point and click and get your REST APIs. But end of the day, point and click is not what deploys to production. So there's a saved worksheet, saved file, saved clipboard. The other thing, and I will not have time for it today, is in SQL CL, we added support for liquid-based. So we basically took all the support that was in liquid-based for Oracle, threw it away, and rebuilt it from scratch and expanded it. On Jeff's blog, there's much more detail, but I can tell you some of the things that we're doing there is liquid-based supports ORDS. So I can actually say liquid-based export ORDS. It generates me a liquid-based control file and change that. And then I can take that with SQL CL and say apply it to production. The nice thing there is really not that I can do that for ORDS. It's that I can export a table, an Apex app. We did the same treatment for Apex and an ORDS REST API and pack it up into one deliverable package, check that in, put it through the system, put it through change control, put it in a pipeline, and actually deploy it to production. So we're trying to not only support, I'll say, first-class objects in the database, like tables, views, procedures. Honestly, that's easy. The harder thing is now going into maybe second-class or pseudo objects, so that we can go in and say, I want to export, what do we have here? ORDS module test2. And I want to export APEX application 101. And by the way, these 3 tables changed. You can actually pack all those up into one change set and move it through production. And this stuff just works. So again, back to everyone probably heard we did some COVID stuff. We literally only use Liquibase to deploy Apex apps, entire DDL changes from the dev environment all the way through production. 0 problems, 0 exceptions, and we did, I forget the time interval, but there was basically 6-7 production pushes done, and there was over 700 DDL statements executed dynamically. So it automatically snapshots the before. It calculates the alters that are required. It parses the payload to make sure they're sequenced properly, and then it actually applies them, and it just works. So now, shifting gears from that, another piece of ORDS is REST-enabled Sql. So REST-enabled Sql, for folks that are used to Sql Dev, what we actually did is code reuse. So we actually factored out the most low-level pieces of Sql Developer. First, we actually made Sql CL, so it's literally the same code base, but factored down to obviously not have UI, not have things like that. And then we further reused it in ORDS, and things like host and spool were cut off. So we have one common core base that is the same SQL scripting engine that is in Sql Dev, Sql CL, and ORDS. So if one script works in any one of those, it will work in all of them. Obviously, with the exclusions of if there's point and click, if there's a pop-up dialog for a bind in Sql Dev Desktop versus a text mode pop-up prompt versus in ORDS, you can't touch the host, you can't issue the connect command, you can't do things like that. Really short of time. So this is the latest Sql Dev. I did a build last night. So some of the things that are coming here, will end on the roadmap slide, but some of the things that are coming here, you'll notice there's full user management now. So I can actually come in, I can create users, I can REST enable those users. I can type the same password twice even. I can REST enable, I can change, all the normal things you would expect are coming. And then just like in Sql Dev, there's the dialogues for what I want to grant, what I want to create. We put the nice, easy, fast pass link right there so that I can go straight to Sql Dev Web and log in. So I can create a user, REST enable him, change his alias to something else or not in this case, and then send them an email with a link and say, here's your login to the database. I don't know if folks used it much, but I personally like it. There's a thing in the database called, in Sql Developer, called Database Monitor. It's a really nice chart, unbiasedly said, of activity in the database. So this is what's going on in my little local Docker database, which is not much because I'm sitting here talking to you guys, but you can see that as this grows, it will come back. You can see there's network activity going on, there's wait events, there's my sessions, there's my active sessions, idle sessions, block sessions, there's my CPU compression, how much database work is being done, here's my wait events, here's my top SQL. The nice thing here is this is 100% REST API driven. So if anyone has doubts over what you can do over REST, this screen right here, as you watch it, the charts are moving. We've got oscillation going on for monitoring network traffic, IO traffic, multiple charts going, 100% driven by REST in ORDS. The other things that are in Sql Dev Web, oops, No. So we worked with the EM team, and we actually pulled over their performance hub. So if you have SQL Dev Web installed local now, you can actually get to Perf Hub. You can go down and drill into SQL statements, get its ASH data, get its metrics, get what's going on, what its activity is. You can kind of do all of those types of diagnostics from here. And then there's many, many other things coming, including a rework of the entire homepage. So there's a lot of work going on SQL Dev Web. With that, I'm short on time, so I'm going to skip the next couple slides and go straight to the roadmap. Oh, real quick, since we talked about REST SQL, we actually created a JWT driver that talks to REST SQL. So I can actually do a connect KLRice at, and I can give it the URL of my SQL Dev Web. So I'll make this big. Notice I'm doing a connect at HTTP. It looks very non-Oracle, but then it's up, it's running. That was just 100% over REST. So no SQLnet access at all. Straight REST only from SQL CL. More things coming, more things coming. All right, so here's the roadmap. So if anyone's curious what we're doing, so there's a lot of work going on here. You guys are more than welcome to read this, but there's no shortage of things coming for SQL Dev Web, for UIs, for web-based development, for ORDS features. So I am officially 2 minutes over, so I guess we should do short Q&A.
Quiz. I'm sorry, but time flies. But it was really just a real example with section. A connection via HTTP. It's new. We did a few questions. Scroll down on the question marker if you want to answer them yourself. Otherwise, I can read them.
I don't see anything.
So you don't see. Yeah. In that case, I have to read it for you.
Yeah, I don't see anything in the questions or the chat or anything.
Okay. So Amer, he asked the first question. My first question is, which configuration must be done to use Enabled Sql? Could you mention in details, please? Well, to be honest, I don't think this is possible because we don't have the time for that.
Yeah, so real quick, it's in the doc. It's literally named Enabled SQL.
Seems like Tobias has a connection problem.
I think we lost him now.
Yeah, so let's continue with some questions. Let me have a look if there's anything there. So let's see. Oh, that's okay. So which pros and cons for using the following ways: REST-enabled SQL, web source module with APEX exec, and APEX web service make REST requests? Do you see any difference between those three? So REST-enabled SQL, APEX exec, and APEX web service make REST request.
I think the question is from APEX. If I call out with these three mechanisms, which one is kind of optimal? The answer again is vague, and it depends on user the use case, right? REST SQL is obviously the maximum flexibility. You type in SQL, you get your response back. Using a defined REST endpoint has maximum control because then the remote side is controlling exactly what REST API is allowed to come in or out. So it's a matter of flexibility in use case. I hate having to give vague non-answers, but it is.
Yeah, it is. No, it's clear. So Tobias, you can go on. You're visible again.
Yeah. Well, Sven Weller, I couldn't see the question you was asking, but I think it was not this one. Sven Weller was asking, since each ORDS under APEX opens up multiple connection pools, APEX, APEX RT, APEX PU, against the database, setting up multiple ORDS would multiple the number of concurrent connections. Are there any config settings to make sure to not overload the database with too many sessions?
So the short answer is yes, of course, because the database has ultimate control on number of connections allowed. The easier way to help here is, I forget the setting just because I haven't got it right in front of me. You can actually set up ORDS to have one connection pool only for all of those users. So we can actually use the one ORDS public user connection pool only, and it will use that one pool for Apex public user, Apex listener, the old school Apex REST user, and use the one pool for that. So that's probably the best way, but then of course the database controls everything.
Maybe I can ask a question myself as well. Are there any plans to support other databases other than the Oracle database for ORDS to connect to?
Yep, on that roadmap slide that I did not spend time reading, you'll notice there was MySQL on that list.
Okay, great.
Another question, is current user also set if I go out 2.0 client credential authentication?
Yeah, I believe it should be. If not, it's probably a bug.
Okay. Another question from Rumen Ivanov. Great presentation. Do you have it online?
I think I'm supposed to. I think I'm supposed to load it somewhere. I'll probably take out the roadmap slide just because that's like the iffy safe harbor, but the rest of it's all fine to go.
Okay. Michelle Weinberger asked, is there some support for Webdav? I would like to edit Word documents like in SharePoint.
Oh boy. So the short answer is no. There's no native support for Webdav. The longer answer, of course, is the XDB listener supports Webdav. So you could make a pass-through that talks to Webdav. Webdav itself as a protocol isn't crazy complicated. If you wanted to spend the hours, you could actually implement it, but there's nothing native.
Okay. Well, time is flying. Another question from Birgit Liebscher. Some hints how to a Swagger document for my API.
I'm sorry, you cut out. How to do a document for what?
Well, some hints how to auto-generate a Swagger document for my API.
Oh,
I don't know what.
Auto-generating Swagger. So that's, again, like you said, time flies. ORDS does automatically generate Swagger documents. And in the latest 19.4.4 will be going live soon. It's actually in OCI now. If anyone's on cloud, you can actually just do yum install ORDS and it puts it there. It will automatically generate Swagger documents. And we're going deeper so that we can add like descriptions in, and then those descriptions would even show up in the Swagger documents.
Okay. I think, well, maybe one more question, and the other ones I will say.
Sure.
On autonomous days, concurrent REST posts from outside to connect GPS positions come from this. I can repeat the question.
Yeah, you cut out completely there. So I heard something about on autonomous latitude, longitude, something.
Okay.
Let me take over there. Let me take over, Tobias, because your connection is pretty poor. So on autonomous database, how many concurrent REST posts from outside to connection pool? We have GPS positions coming in from trucks. So how many concurrent REST posts are allowed from the outside to an autonomous database? That's
so for a paid autonomous service right now, there are currently 3 ORDS nodes. Each node per tenant is 100 connections. So it should be able to sustain, you know, with that proxy double session counting I was talking about, it should be able to sustain, you know, somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 concurrent. Now, again, performance comes into play. So if you're doing 200 concurrent at 10 seconds a pop, obviously that's not sustainable versus 200 concurrent at a fraction of a second.
All right. Let's wrap it up. Sorry for the connection drop, that can happen. But thanks for your presentation. It was really good. I hope your health is getting better in the coming days, because
yes.
you had a little bit of a cough there, but yeah, hope to see you anytime soon in person again, maybe in Germany again for a next version of Apex Connect. Thanks.
And if anyone has questions to follow up, like I said, I'm not hard to find. Twitter is a great little medium for asking questions and whatnot.
Yeah, all right. Then thanks again. And then we'll yeah, go over to the next presenter. That will be Kenan.